The Exodus of Africa, reclaiming the sacred ancestry of the Bantu, Lamba, and Igbo peoples. A narrative erased. For generations, the story of Africa's sacred identity has been distorted or erased. Mainstream biblical scholarship has centered the Middle East and Europe as the primary domains of revelation, faith, and heritage, while Africa has been relegated to footnotes or exoticized parables. But within the heartbeat of Africa itself lies a spiritual memory so ancient, so consistent, and so deeply rooted that it defies the imposed narratives. Africans did not learn their sacred traditions from missionaries. They carried them long before the first European ship arrived. In the songs of griots, the rhythms of rituals, and the architecture of kinship structures, there are echoes of ancient Israelite culture. The Bantu migration, the customs of the Lamba, and the profound spiritual systems of the Igbo people all challenged the notion that sacred history began elsewhere and was exported southward. Instead, they offer compelling evidence that Africa is not the recipient of divine heritage, but its source. This article reclaims the African roots of biblical tradition. It highlights the sacred migration of the Bantu, the priestly legacy of the Lamba, the resilient spirituality of the Igbo, and the colonial forces that sought to bury this truth. It reframes geography, exposes appropriation, and resurrects memory not through fantasy, but through documented tradition and living heritage. The Bantu Exodus, Africa's sacred migration. The Bantu migration is one of the most profound movements of people in human history. Originating around 3000 BCE near the regions of Cameroon, Nigeria, and the Benue Valley, this wave of migration swept through vast territories. From Central Africa and the Great Lakes, down to Southern Africa. It was not merely a journey of survival, it was a sacred relocation, filled with symbolic and ritual importance. Oral traditions among Bantu-speaking groups often recount journeys through lands of fire, crossings of great rivers, desert wanderings, and encounters with divine signs, all bearing uncanny resemblance to the biblical Exodus led by Moses. These stories were passed down long before the written Bible arrived in Africa. They speak of covenant with ancestors, laws given by spiritual elders, and a collective identity forged through wandering and adversity. Ritual practices such as sacrificial cleansing, food taboos, and elder-led leadership structures further mirror those found in the Torah. But unlike the scriptural text, these traditions are rooted in oral rhythm and sacred silence, carried through drum, dance, and memory. To dismiss them as coincidence is to overlook the depth of spiritual continuity. Today, many Bantu groups still perform rituals that resemble Levitical law. Circumcision rites, naming ceremonies, and moral codes governed by ancestral legacy are not borrowed, they are indigenous. They predate the arrival of Christianity, yet are often branded as influenced by them. This assumption reveals not African mimicry, but Western ignorance of Africa's ancient sovereignty. Traditions before the text. Africa's sacred systems are not derivative, they are original. Before scripture was written, sacred laws were danced, sung, and whispered into the soil. Across Bantu, Nilotic, and other African cultures, traditions exist that mirror those later codified in the Torah. Circumcision was practiced as a rite of passage long before Jewish arrival. It marked entrance into spiritual maturity, community responsibility, and divine awareness. Dietary laws, including abstention from pork, shellfish, and scavengers, align with the concept of ritual purity. Sacred washings and mourning practices mirror ritual cleansing and purification rites. 7-day cycles, festivals of harvest, and days of rest reflect Sabbath traditions. Priestly clans and sacred duties passed down through lineage recall the Levite model. These customs were lived, not written. And because African societies transmitted wisdom orally, they maintained fluidity and resilience, adapting without losing essence. The arrival of colonial missionaries often interrupted this rhythm, attempting to label these practices as heathen unless recognized in scripture. The irony? These heathen rites often matched the very laws of Moses the missionaries came to teach. Furthermore, African cosmologies, such as those among the Yoruba, Dogon, and Akan, conceive of divine hierarchy, moral accountability, and spiritual law that mirror prophetic systems. The notion of chosen lineage, exile, restoration, and sacrifice is not foreign to Africa. It is elemental. The Lamba, priests of Senna. Among the most striking examples of African Israelite legacy is the Lamba people, spread across Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Mozambique. The Lamba have maintained for centuries that their ancestors were Israelite priests who migrated from a place called Senna, possibly linked to ancient Judea or Yemen. They practice customs deeply aligned with ancient Judaism. Ritual animal slaughter with sacred prayers. Dietary restrictions, including kosher-like taboos. Male circumcision as spiritual initiation. Belief in monotheism, distinct from neighboring tribes. Endogamy, particularly within priestly clans. In 1999, genetic studies revealed that members of the Lemba's priestly Buba clan carry the Cohen modal haplotype, a genetic marker associated with the Jewish priesthood, Kohanim. This startling discovery validated oral tradition, offering scientific support for what the Lamba had always known. They did not adopt sacred tradition, they inherited it. Despite this, their story remains sidelined in mainstream Jewish discourse. Why? Because it complicates the narrative of heritage and challenges racialized assumptions about who can truly be Jewish. The Lamba remind us that Africa was never outside the covenant, it was within it. The Igbo and their divine lineage. In Nigeria, the Igbo people have long asserted a spiritual lineage connected to the tribes of Israel. Some Igbo clans identify with specific tribes, Gad, Dan, Levi, and maintain practices that align with ancient Hebrew customs. Observance of clean versus unclean foods. Sabbath-like rest days and sacred festivals. Complex systems of ritual purity and community law. Ancestral altars and sacred priesthood. Strong emphasis on covenant between the people and a singular creator. During colonial rule, British missionaries dismissed Igbo claims as superstition or mimicry, yet the spiritual continuity persisted. Modern Igbo communities have revived interest in these ancient practices, and synagogues now stand on Igbo soil, reconnecting global Jewish communities to their African brothers. Moreover, Igbo resilience amid oppression, surviving slavery, genocide, and political marginalization echoes the biblical narrative of exile and return. Their story is not a borrowed myth, it is a living prophecy. Rewriting by the colonizers. Colonialism was not just territorial, it was epistemic. European powers sought to reshape the African mind, dismantling spiritual systems and replacing them with imported theology. African rituals were labeled pagan, customs were criminalized, and oral wisdom was silenced. European scholars arrived with pens and notebooks, documenting African traditions with curiosity but then repackaging them through a Western lens. Rituals were labeled primitive Judaism or borrowed Christianity. The possibility that Africans had preserved divine truths independently was too radical to accept. In schools, African children were taught European history as global history. They memorized Hebrew genealogies but never studied their own. The sacred memory of their ancestors became a secret, whispered only in the villages and hidden behind colonial churches. This rewriting was intentional. To dominate Africa, colonizers had to sever its memory. And so, even when African practices mirrored biblical law, they were dismissed as coincidence or contamination. Entire generations grew up believing that sacredness had to come from abroad. But the rhythm never died. Despite centuries of distortion, African spirituality persisted, in drumbeats, in rituals, in defiance. The colonizers may have captured land, but they never owned the soul. Reframing geography, Middle East as Africa. The geographic division between Africa and the Middle East is a colonial fiction. Historically, the lands of Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, and even ancient Canaan were considered part of Northeast Africa. The Red Sea and Sinai Peninsula are connective tissues, not boundaries. Ancient maps often placed the Fertile Crescent within Africa's sphere. Ethiopia, Cush, and Egypt are central players in the Bible, not peripheral nations. Moses was raised in Africa. His wife was Ethiopian. The Israelites fled through African deserts, received wisdom on African mountains, and found refuge in African kingdoms. Yet, the rise of colonial geography rebranded these lands as Middle East, creating psychological and theological distance. This allowed Europe to claim divine proximity, redefining sacred history around their maps. To reclaim African divinity, we must also reclaim African geography. The sacred did not skip Africa, it was born from its soil. Conclusion: restoration of ancestral truth. Africa's spiritual legacy is not an echo, it is the source. The traditions of the Bantu, the priesthood of the Lamba, and the resilient soul of the Igbo are not borrowed, they are remembered. The sacred laws, migration patterns, and ritual disciplines passed down over millennia are not remnants, they are revelations. Colonialism tried to silence this truth. Geography tried to reroute it. Theology tried to rename it. But the ancestral rhythm persists, in song, in ceremony, and in identity. It's time for the world to listen. Africa's story is not peripheral to the Bible, it is its living root. And when Africans speak of sacred origin, they do so not from borrowed books, but from blood memory. Let the scroll be reopened. Let the silence be broken. Africa remembers, and the world must now hear.